I think the American people obviously do not support this. I think many American people find how it's been conducting this war has been disgusting. It's a war of choice that seems to be waged largely on the people of Iran. Um, can this continue much longer?
I don't know. We don't see any signs of a real resistance, within. But no, maybe I should take that back. We are, like, we saw virtually nothing before the war, which again I think is shameful because look, we saw it coming. Everybody knew it was coming, but nobody, very, very, very few people spoke out against it, within Congress. But now more and more people are. Actually, it is being condemned, largely by the Democrats, but by those exceptional Republicans as well. And as you pointed out, the majority of people do not approve of this war in this country. There's only one country in the world that's solidly behind this war, and that's Israel. There was a poll that came out recently, and it showed that it was support for this war, I think, for the entire Jewish Israeli population is, upwards of 90%. For self-identified like conservatives, it's 98%. For self-identified leftists, it's 75%. It's across the political spectrum. There are so few people against this war in Israel. There's one member of the Knesset that has spoken out against it. One, and of course his life is being threatened. But in our country, there is opposition, and I hope that they actually, back up words with action. It'll be easier, the longer this goes on, and the clearer it becomes that this was not well planned, and maybe it's really when we begin to suffer economic consequences of this war. When prices at the gas pump. Well, I don't know how long that'll take. The price of oil is rising, significantly, but it's nowhere near, stratospheric levels or the level that would really cause pain. But I think at some point it will be, maybe in the not too distant future. I don't really know how these oil markets work. But yeah, again, this is something that we talked about ahead of time. This war was not, sold to either to Congress or to the American people the way previous wars have been. We've had these campaigns. Again, there's the administration that prepares a war is will lie through its teeth, but it'll work hard at lying to convince people. This administration didn't do that, and so there's they started off with very little support, and I think that again, if it continues to go badly, that will dwindle, and that's one reason to hope. It's just maybe there will be a real, reaction to this, and Trump may have his hands forced, but he's going to, again, he's going to be very, very reluctant to pull out of this. He's really committed to it. He's been, he's surrounded by sycophants, as we've talked about. But again, the economic consequences, if gas prices start to really take off, if the markets take a nosedive, he's shown himself to be sensitive to those kind of things in the past, and I'm sure his rich friends are too. So, perhaps it'll get through to him, and he'll declare victory after and just leave the mess. It'll. Who knows
Is
how
that
many
possible?
billions of dollars of damage have already been done to our bases there.
But even if we say like, okay, we're done, can we just say we're done? All those bases in the Middle East, they're gone, right? We Iran's not going to just say, okay, you can rebuild these bases that we attacked,
Yeah, I
right?
don't know. Yeah, and it's not clear what the host countries are going to do. This was a deal that they thought they had. Okay, we give up a bit of sovereignty in exchange for security, and it's turned out to be the opposite, right? I think I heard it was just yesterday that the UAE finally officially declared that they closed their airspace to, to Israeli and American aircraft. But that's a sign that they are, rethinking their policy, I believe. Now, Saudi Arabia and these other countries made that kind of declaration earlier, but there's a lot of evidence that they said one thing and they're allowing something else to happen. It was just a report today. There was an F-35 that forgot to turn off its transponder, and you could see it flying right over Saudi Arabia. And that doesn't surprise me. That happened in the last war.
Where do you see these Gulf states going? Do you see them breaking ties with the United States?
I don't know. It's there's a chance. It just depends on how far this war goes, how much damage is done. Um, you know, there are long-standing ties. There's a lot of it, kind of institutional and inertia. Um, Even when it becomes obvious that you really should change your policies, it's hard to do. This is the way we've done it for generations here. This is, but but if they suffer enough pain, they may really reconsider. They may close down bases. They may say, hey, we had a bargain and you didn't keep your side of it. I don't know. I'm not going to put any faith in these Gulf monarchies. They've just shown they could just be paid off under the table. But those payoffs have to be real big, because these guys, they expect billions, and I'm sure the U.S. will do whatever it takes. They'll pull out all stops to try to keep them, in line and on their side. And there'll be all kinds of apologies and payments, maybe direct payments to individuals, but also promises to invest in their economy, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that would be kind of hard for Trump. He's always talking about, he's a transactional president where other people pay him. But so we'll see, maybe Trump will just misplay his hand there, and they could be bought off, but he fails to do it, and starts demanding more. And then, some of them maybe, I don't know, could say, forget this. But in any case, yeah, a great deal of damage has been done. I saw a very interesting report by one defense analyst, Patricia Marins, said, in the 12-day war, later studies showed that the Israelis spent $2 billion a day, just the Israelis alone, on that war. And we can assume that they're spending that again, at least that. And the U.S., I think it's reasonable to assume that they're spending like 3 times that much. So we're not talking about the damage done to the facilities. That's an extra price tag. But just for the operations and all of the munitions that are being expended, we're talking about $8 billion a day. They can't keep that up, and again, I don't think they have enough munitions to keep that up. But in these first few weeks, that's what they're, first couple of weeks at least, that's what they're going to be spending. And then it's going to be very, very expensive all around.
Is the U.S. keeping these Gulf monarchies in power? Is that one of the reasons that this arrangement is the way it is? That if they're afraid that if the U.S. pulls out, then they will be overthrown? Like, does their security come,
Yeah, I think that's probably right. That's part of when you're talking about, the security arrangement. That's really what they're concerned about. It's like, making sure that they have a powerful partner that can keep them in power, especially in the case of Bahrain, where we have a Sunni monarchy ruling over a largely Shia population. But it's not just, I think you just had to point to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is is a major regional power, and they do back these Gulf monarchies, especially Bahrain. There have been riots there in the past, and the Saudis have sent in their people to suppress them, and they're doing that again apparently right now.
Do you think that have you heard much actually about false flags? Like, there was the Saudi Arabia, apparently Saudi Aramco. Iran says they didn't hit that.
Yeah,
saying that it was probably Israel.
Right, we talked about that.
There was a drone into Azerbaijan. There was a drone in Cyprus. And
Right. I think those probably are false flags. I'm not a guy to jump on that bandwagon very quickly, but I think that's what they are. These Iranians have no reason, like, to send a drone into Azerbaijan or a missile into Turkey. I mean, there's always a chance that something malfunctioned, but it's also very, very believable that it was a false flag. It was something, I think, especially in the case of Azerbaijan, and this is very worrying. Again, Azerbaijan, a nominally Muslim country, is very closely allied with Israel. Israel has a base there. And that, okay, when this drone went in, immediately the Iranians said, expressed their condolences for those who were injured or killed, but they also denied that they had anything to do with it immediately. And I think they clearly didn't. And it's interesting, like the Turks made a statement that kind of indirectly supported the Iranians, but the Azerbaijanis, Aliyev, um, basically the dictator there, um, immediately seized on this and denounced the Iranians and started moving all kinds of military assets right to the border. And so there's a real risk that this was set up, as an excuse for an invasion of Iran, from Azerbaijan. You know, this is he's probably being pressured by both the Americans and the Israelis to do this. And then we've seen similar things. There's been a lot of contradictory reports about what's happening in Iraqi Kurdistan. You say that there are Kurds there are organizing, are preparing to invade. There actually have been reports that there have been incursions or an attempted invasion. I think there may have actually been an incursion, but it was repulsed, that they're going to try to take that territory that's inhabited by Iranian Kurds. So, again, Iran is a very ethnically diverse country. About 10% of Iranians are actually Kurds, and about 20% are Azeris, that are belong to the same ethnic group that you find in Azerbaijan. So this is something that we may see, and that's going to create a real headache for the Iranians. And then I'm sure if there's a ground incursion, the U.S. and the Israel will provide air support. So it could create real difficulties for the Iranians. We'll see.
Seems like we are always using the Kurds. You think the Kurds would get tired of being used? It seems like they always get thrown under the bus at the end of the day, again and again and again by us. So it's Iraq, Syria, wherever, and then you're going to piss off the Turks as well.
So there are countervailing forces, especially in the case of the Kurds. I think that's very important to point out. Right, because the Turks do not want to see a Kurdistan established. They do not want to see an independent Kurdish state. And so there is a chance that, if that really looks like it's starting to take place, they might intervene and attack the Kurds. A very good chance of that. We know they're hypersensitive about Kurdish independence or, the establishment of any kind of Kurdistan. Yeah, but it would be just incredibly stupid on the parts of the Kurds to do it. They were betrayed in Syria. Everybody saw it coming, apparently, except for the Kurds themselves. They were betrayed in Syria we're talking about a few weeks ago. So are they going to do this? Maybe they're that stupid. They just have hotheads that believe what they're told. I would be more worried about the Azeris. On the other hand, these groups are very well integrated within. They are, ethnic Azeris and ethnic Kurds, but they have been part of Iran for centuries, is my understanding. It's not like so they do have an Azerian identity or Kurdish identity, but they do have a real Iranian identity. That's not something that has just been, imposed on them recently. And the president of Iran is, my understanding is he's Azeri, or at least part Azeri, Pezeshkian. And that's not unusual. I think even, the Ayatollah, there's just many people in the leadership are either belong to these different ethnic minorities or, have parents or, grandparents that belong to these ethnic minorities. So it's not clear that they can actually get any sort of uprising to occur. I'm sure you can find some separatists within these regions to work with the invading forces, but I think the majority of the population will, stand with Iran. But that may change over time if everybody starts to suffer at some point. People's allegiances will break down under long-term suffering. But I think we're a long, long ways from that.
Yeah. Do you see Turkey getting more involved? Because Turkey is quite a military power. Yeah. They could really sway the balance of things.
It's not impossible. Well, again, if the Kurds become involved, I think the Turks probably would become involved. I think that would be a real trigger for them. Would they actually help? Again, they are a member of NATO, and their relations with Iran are not really very good, I think, especially after the fall of Syria. But on the other hand, I think they do not want to see Iran actually fall. because they understand that they would be like the next, um, let's say, dish on the table. If if Iran goes, then like the one remaining power that can actually oppose Israel in a significant way is Turkey. They would be and then there's already been talk among the Israelis. Certain Israeli officials will say, yeah, it's going to be Turkey next or something, and I'm sure the Turks are aware they don't want to do that.
The Israelis are so crazy to even be voicing that at this stage, and the fact that you said like 90% of Jewish Israelis are for this war with Iran, even though they're getting hit hard, and the United States, it's obviously not a popular war here, but we also don't have the danger of being overrun. Israel does. They have a war breaking out in Lebanon that could descend into a civil war that could easily start to spill over into them. You have Egypt right below where everybody's upset. Who knows how long Sisi can stay in power if things start, as this progresses. And then same thing with Jordan. It's a majority Palestinian population, that are being ruled under this Jordanian king that is just being bought off by the U.S. As this continues, like Israel's in real danger of it just. They lose control, and then all of a sudden it's like it spills right into their country. They're not in a safe place. I just don't understand why they're so gung-ho for this when we're looking at what I see is almost the inevitable destruction of their country through this war.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is a kind of a deep abiding faith in the IDF within Israel that crosses the political spectrum. And even when people hate Netanyahu, when the IDF goes to war, they support the IDF. I think that's a big part of it. And then it just in general, Israel has, not just the leadership, but the people as a whole has decided that that the only solution, the only way to gain security is through military action. It's just like that's where we need to be feared, above all. That used to be, that's actually always been voiced, at least within, certain parts of the political class in Israel, certainly going back to the early Zionists. We need to be feared above all. But that has become the thinking, I think, of all Israelis. And so the more death and destruction that we deal to the people around us, the more they'll fear us and the safer we'll be.
The more they hate you.
I know. It's just like eventually, though, you just overplay your hand. I don't know if this will be the time or it'll be sometime in the future, but eventually you overplay your hand and you have made, just bitter enemies of everyone around you. In the end, that's not good for your security. You may be able to keep them down for a while, but eventually you won't. You'll lose control, and then it's going to be very, very bad for you.
Right. We've talked many times about where this war will go, and I often say that I think it's going to go nuclear. Do you think that we're being a bit dramatic about the risk of nukes in this situation where we are now, or is it,
Yeah, I don't think it will go nuclear, but there is a risk that it will go nuclear, and it's a non-negligible risk. Again, it's just that this is a poorly thought out war. The other side has shown that it can actually fight back. These are two powers that have kind of developed this, a sense of invincibility, and it's that, or an aura of invincibility, which is very, very important for them to maintain. So even if we're not talking about a real existential threat, if it looks like they're losing that aura of invincibility, they will be tempted to go nuclear. It's like, I don't know that they will, because there are real consequences, that even these crazies are aware of. But there is a risk. And so I think we have to talk about it, because it's such a horrible thing that even if we're talking about 1%, 1% is way, way too high, And I think there's at least a 1% chance, maybe, but I think probably more than that this could end up being nuclear. I'm not going to put an exact number on it, but it's non-negligible. And so we need to talk about it.
Right. And we have to talk about it because what we're seeing is the U.S. immediately go to this carpet bombing type of campaign but what else can they do? You can't win a war this way. Will they do boots on the ground? There's been talk about that.
Right.
And that's the only. I'm just trying to think about the steps of the escalation ladder, because we would, when we were watching the Ukraine war, we could see it kind of escalate step by step by step. Here with the Iran war, it's just going straight to the top, and then you're like, okay, well, what else can the U.S. do here? It seems like they're doing everything they can, short of boots on the ground and nuclear weapons. Am I missing something? I'm not even so sure what our Navy is really doing, because it sounds like it keeps on getting close and then running away.
Yeah, right. We don't know. The Iranians say that with their missiles, they chased, and drones, they chased the USS Abraham Lincoln to more than 1,000 kilometers away, where it's going to be much less effective. It means that shorter sorties and fewer sorties. I don't know. That hasn't been confirmed. It may or may not be true. But then there is this talk. There's been talk, like you say, about boots on the ground. The Pentagon, I guess Hegseth and Trump won't rule that out. I think they'd be very reluctant to do it. But if things go, see, the thing is, when you go into a war and you have your plan A, you think that this is going to work out one way, it doesn't, and then you find yourself in a war, with the chance of a real defeat, and you start to consider options that you didn't want to consider before. That's what happens in war. Unfortunately, that's what happens, and you start to do things that you had forsworn in the past. There's no way I'm going to do that. That would be suicide, or that would just have such horrible consequences. But then you start to realize, man, I'm going to lose this war unless I try this or that. We've got to. You go up the escalation ladder, and so we could go to boots on the ground. I think they're going to probably try to convince like Azerbaijan to do that for them, and the Kurds. The hapless Kurds. And another thing they're talking about is providing escorts, naval escorts for tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. But that just seems so foolish. The Iranians would just jump for joy if they heard that they just decided to do that, because, it's really hard to hit your ships when they're hundreds of kilometers off the coast, and maybe we don't have the ability, or only if we get lucky, we'll hit one. But if you take them through the Strait of Hormuz, those ships are going to be in visual range, and they just have, that whole coastline is Iranian, and they have, both at the Strait and on the Persian Gulf side and the Gulf of Oman side for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And they have all kinds of short range missiles and drones that can very easily hit a ship that traveling through that strait or approaching the strait. That would be extraordinarily foolish. I think the Navy is just going to say no. I think
they already. I think they already did. I think Trump said that, and the U.S. Navy is like, yeah, no, that's not happening. We can't do that. So
we'll see. But if he makes a direct order, they may go ahead and do it. If he insists against their advice. But that would be chalk one up for the Iranians. The Iranians would say, okay, good, we get to sink some U.S. naval vessels.
So do we see this war progressing in that it kind of continues the way it's currently going, but both sides are running out of defense? Well, we don't know fully about the defensive capabilities, but we know that the U.S. is running out of defensive capabilities. There's a chance, he said, that Iran might be harboring some of their air defense for when the U.S. thinks that it's safe and they start flying sorties over. Because from what's happening now primarily is the U.S., they're doing what do they call, like standoff strikes. They go up to the border and then fire. They're not flying directly over the airspace. I think some Reaper drones are flying directly over Iranian airspace. A couple of those have been shot down.
Yeah, I think several have been. And it looks like probably the Iranians shot down at least one F-15 so far. There's some
There's
footage
been five,
available.
Right?
Five total that have been brought down. And three, the U.S. claims was actually a friendly fire incident, which may be true. We don't know, but it was also very close to Iranian airspace, so maybe it was Iranians. We just don't know. I can't come down on one side or the other of that, but it looks like at least one of them was almost certainly or very likely, shot down by the Iranians. Um, yeah, again, I just think it's very unlikely that the Iranians are putting all their air defense assets out, in the open right now. It just wouldn't make sense. You have them. We may be just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and when the Israelis are crowing about destroying half of those, air defense assets, they maybe just destroyed half of the tip of the iceberg, if even that. But we will have to see. Again, it's just like we don't know. We're just making guesses. But I think so far our guesses have been pretty good about what Iran was going to do. And actually, the Iranians have moved faster than I expected, and have probably done even more damage to the bases. And again, it's not to military personnel, but to those extremely important and expensive, military installations that they're taking out methodically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you think then we will see talks about boots on the ground before we hear talk about any use of a tactical nuclear weapon or anything?
Probably. I think that's the very top of the ladder. It would have to be.
Right. But I don't see much underneath these two, boots on the ground and
well,
nukes.
we've got the Azeris.
Right.
And the Kurds.
If you can mobilize, some factions.
Right.
But I don't. Yeah. I just find it difficult to believe that it will be successful. It's this war, like the groundwork wasn't done. The PR wasn't done. Like the way that the U.S. and Israel have been conducting themselves recently is just abhorrent, and it's shocking everybody. So it's just like, well, people don't want to fight for the bad guys. I know money can do a lot, but at some point people are just like, I have some honor. I'm not going to do this. I just don't see maybe I'm wrong. And we're able to print enough money to convince to have a mercenary Kurdish or Azerbaijani army go in.
Yeah. I don't know. You just have to believe that they've been working on this for a long time. The Israelis and the Americans have been very active in, among the Kurds for decades. They've always seen them as an asset, and I'm sure that they have prepared a certain number of them for this. And it just remains to see if they're just foolish enough to go along with it.
Yeah, we always find some sucker to die for our wars.
Yeah, but again, though, the Turks would be, in the case of the Kurds, certainly would just be very, very, I'm sure, are strongly opposed to it. So we may be getting pushback, behind the scenes from the Turks right now, as they're saying, you don't do that. If you do it, we're closing out our, our airspace. I don't care if we're NATO or whatever, or if you do it, we're going in after them. I think that may be very well what's going behind the scenes. I think I would be more worried about Aliyev and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, nothing gets the Turks' blood boiling more than Kurds.
Yeah, no, I remember, like back in the 1970s, it seems like there was always, because there was really a very, very bloody insurrection, suppression of that insurrection. There's a long history between the Turks and the Kurds.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to show you an NBC clip. You might have seen it already. They're asking Iraqi about a ground invasion in here. I want you to watch his response.
Has not ruled out boots on the ground in Iran. Are you afraid of a U.S. invasion in your country?
No, we are waiting for them.
You are waiting for the U.S. military to invade the ground troops?
Yes. Because we are confident that we can confront them, and that would be a big disaster for them.
Yeah, I think he's right. I don't think that's just, hot air. I think it would be a disaster. Again, we're talking about a country of 93 million people, and they're going to fight. That's one thing. Of course, Saddam Hussein and his Iraqi army discovered that, way back in, I guess it was 1980 when he invaded Iran. Iran was in disarray at that time. It was right after the revolution. But the people immediately responded. They went to the front, and including Khamenei. He was a cleric, but he went to the front to fight. And I don't doubt that this would happen now. It would be a disaster. Maybe they have a very limited objective, but then they become, they're on the ground there. If they manage to take let's say a piece of Iranian soil, maybe a port or something like that, but then they just become a target. We can see how these missiles, again, they're much safer way out at sea, 1,000 kilometers or how many hundreds of kilometers they're out there. If they're on Iranian soil, that the Iranians are going to go hit that place again and again and again.
Yeah, boots on the ground is just going to be suicidal.